Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday.
So we're going to jump into today's topic, which is about app improvements. And we all have gone through, those of us that have been doing this for a while have been in a situation where we are experiencing some sort of refresh, change, overhaul, any of that. And so when we think about that opportunity, which sometimes is a forced opportunity, we have to decide, do we do incremental refresh or complete overhaul? And so today we're going to talk about how your customer's mental model plays a part in that decision, how you have to also consider the size and scope of that refresh
Yep.
and the time that it'll take to complete. And finally, your customers' tolerance for disruption. So, can your customers tolerate that disruption to their day to day?
Yes. And we do have a bit of experience on both ends, right? The big
Yes,
thing and hey, let's take the incremental approach. So
that's right. That's right. So, let's talk about mental models first. So,
yes.
mental models are a representation that people have in their mind. That's their understanding of how they interact with something, the purpose of that thing, whatever it might be, a system, an environment. We have an understanding of or a mental model that represents those things in our mind. So we know how to interact with them, what we should get or gain from them. So if you think about, for example, your daily routine in the morning when you get dressed, you have a mental model of what that process looks like, the
Yep.
different tools like your toothbrush and the shower and all those different things that you'll use in that process. And so when you think about your software products, users have a mental model of how they're going to interact with, where they find things, if they're troubleshooting, all that sort of thing.
Yep. Yep.
So let's start with that, the mental model. So what do you think is the right approach, or what do you believe is the right approach in terms of capturing that mental model and then using it in those decisions?
Yeah, so right approach in that regard, or right approach in terms of how we address, making these changes. Oh,
Both.
yeah, okay. So, I mean, you can't ignore the mental model, right? Especially if you have a product or service, like you said, anything of that nature, that you've got a customer base. Um, Sometimes they may be a pretty loyal customer base and you're going to shake things up, but they definitely, already have expectations. They have ways they know to interact with the system, so you have to, no matter which approach you take, actually, you have to take that mental model into consideration. And that's a lot of times when it comes down to how do you want to bring in these changes, or do you do incremental? I lean toward that almost all the time because you start shaping that mental model while you're maintaining systems around that mental model, but you can also slowly shape and introduce those changes that you hope are still going to be based on the user preferences, the user needs, even if it is kind of going outside their comfort zone. It's really rare that we go. We'll get into it, but that you want to like literally flip off the light switch or switch it on. The Big Bang, as I call it. Sorry, I'm getting distracted based on Benadryl today.
No, I totally agree. So when you think about I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Hopefully, I don't hear it. So when you think about the mental model approach, first that means that you've got to do some work to understand your user. So you've
Yes.
got to do that work to step away from just your solution and figure out what is the person doing in that context. We've talked about this before. Making
Mm-hmm.
sure that, and I'm going to put you on mute while I'm talking because that is such a distraction for me. Maybe you can go on. Oh, here we go. Okay. There, we should be okay now. Okay. So when you think about that mental model, you've got to capture it. You've got to make sure that you understand their generic mental model, but then also their mental model in the context of using your product. That requires some level of observation, interviews, documenting aspects of their journey, that sort of thing. And so when you think about, to your point, that incremental for much of our experience has been the way to go, because you can start to then shape that new direction around the way in which they understand they work with your product or your software. Where I've seen that, like, flip the switch, big bang, where I've seen that successfully deployed is in situations or circumstances where they were not enterprise or complex applications, where you're talking about something that is a little more flat, a little bit more of a website versus a software application versus a workflow tool. So in areas where you're talking about software or applications that people use for work, that's a harder sell and a harder approach to employ.
Am I back on? Okay. Are you still here yet? I know it's distracting us, but yeah, absolutely. I think there are a couple of other cases too, even when you're talking about productivity type of applications that really, where people are accomplishing work with the software, not just a website. From what I've seen is if a case to do it is if your back end, so, some of the infrastructure, the architecture is so out, it's really causing problems with your user base. That's a case, that's one case where you might have to do this complete overhaul. Another case is if your competitors are just taking over. So, they are blowing you out of the water. You have to do something, and you've tried the incremental changes. I've been on products like that. You tried to catch up. You tried to make incremental changes, really small changes, without completely disrupting the user base. But you've also far behind. You really are left with that decision that maybe that overhaul, that complete refresh is needed. The other one is if you don't have any customers, so that can, well, actually those two things kind of go hand in hand. If your competitors are really blowing you out of the water, you probably don't have that loyal customer base, and it's time to do something, bigger. So those are the situations I've seen where it can work. And I've seen also where there are acquisitions and there are loyal customer bases on both fronts, when the acquisition occurs, and they're usually buying a product for a reason or a company for a reason because they've got a great customer base. And when you're trying to merge those through integrations and things of that nature, yeah, I've really seen disruption occur, and you've got to kind of take it slow, look at those mental models again, and figure out how do you mesh those things together in that case, or how do I make little changes that give someone maybe a preview of what's to come, but they kind of are able to adjust, learn. You don't want to hit productivity either when you do those kind of big changes. So again, incremental. That's usually 9 times out of 10, or probably 99 out of 100, what I recommend. But those other cases are where you might have to do the complete overhaul, the big bang.
Yeah, I think that's a really, I lean the same way, the incremental. However, I've seen where the incremental was a huge fail. And years ago, working with a client that had a customer base, they were an e-commerce site, and they were primarily serving older adults who were still on AOL. This wasn't that long ago. And so they knew that they had a pretty low tech, laggards as their customers. And so the decision that was made by the product manager that we were working with was to only make slight tweaks. And so even though we saw opportunities to improve aspects of how you log in and some of the primary functions to get to the value of the site, the decision that he made was that we would only change fonts and colors. And so that it was a very aesthetic, surface level refresh that in the end, we questioned the value of the changes and was it really worth the investment and the time that was put into it, because it really didn't make a whole lot of difference. And so fast forward a few years later, they realized that that incremental approach was not going to get them the value that they needed, and the time that it would take to do things in such small increments would have taken for years, forever. So eventually they moved to new platform, new experience, and it was just a complete overhaul. And like you said, it was that flip the switch type of effort, which in the end made more sense for where they were trying to go overall. And I think you touched on it also. You've got to think about how big is that refresh. And that means you've got to start with, once you have that mental model definition in place, you've got to now understand how big is it? What are we trying to refresh? And how are we breaking that up to understand how many years, how many months, what is the timeline for this, and the cost? Because again, sometimes it might be more cost effective to just, if you are using an off the shelf platform, for example, to just do things in a way where you're just starting fresh and putting everything on top of that versus doing things incrementally. So you've got to understand that timeline and the disruption. And you talked about that as well in terms of the disruption to the workflow of the people engaged. Because if you recognize that the learning curve might be a steep learning curve, but if you make it a shorter duration, there might be more tolerance around that versus you keep moving my cheese over time and I'm trying to figure out what's this, where's that kind of thing, and the struggle in figuring things out that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point as well, think about, okay, I'm going to try not to give away too much, but, working on a product that when you talked about the back end systems and the not being up to par. So, let's use the word Silverlight, where it's, you invest all of this money and all of this time making these small changes, trying to catch up with things when your platform, your core, performance is like measurable. There's just no reason to keep going, right? You just go ahead and flip that switch. You've just got to invest the time, you've got to invest some money, you've got to invest some resources to make those changes. Because even if you have clients that have, existing mental model around your system, and by the way, I think just like you said, just because you do an overhaul doesn't mean you can't understand that mental model and try to design or create around that. But you can have a losing battle on your hands when it comes to those back-end systems.
So I definitely think guided tours are helpful. So when you're making incremental changes, consider putting in a guided tour where on launch, someone sees the new areas. There's like an overlay and it highlights those new areas or capabilities and where you can find them. So just to recap, make sure you understand that customer mental model and how disruptive changes will be to their workflows. And then figure out, is it an overhaul or an incremental refresh based on the scope and cost of those changes? And to your point, if you have a broken foundation, you've got to do an overhaul regardless. So you've just got to look at what does that mean from the strategic standpoint around the design changes or the experience changes and go from there. So thank you so much. It sounds like our feedback is gone at the end of our call. But thank you so much for joining us and have a good Tuesday, and we will see you next time.
Great. Bye.